The Middle Ages, that era of imposing castles, knights in shining armor, and illuminated manuscripts that resemble works of art, also has a dark side that doesn't make it onto tourist postcards. Medieval tortures, from the rack that stretched the body to the stake that turned people into human torches, to punishments that seem straight out of a particularly twisted nightmare, are a reminder that humanity could be as inventive with pain as it was with art. It's not a topic to take lightly, but with a touch of almost serious humor, let's explore this chilling corner of medieval Europe, where suffering was a tool for control, confession, and sometimes pure spectacle. Buckle up, because this journey through dungeons, public squares, and disturbed minds is going to be long, informative, and frankly, a bit unsettling. Let's start with the rack, the undisputed king of medieval dungeons. If there was ever a torture device that deserved a place in the Hall of Infamy, it's this one. Picture a sturdy wooden table, something that could pass for rustic furniture on a farm, but equipped with pulleys, ropes, and a crank that seems designed by someone with a very particular sense of entertainment. The victim was tied by their hands and feet to the ends of the table, and then, with a slow and deliberate turn of the crank, the body began to stretch. Slowly, very slowly. Muscles strained to their limits, tendons made noises that would make any orthopedist wince, and joints, well, let's just say they produced sounds you wouldn't want to hear while trying to enjoy a quiet breakfast. The rack was especially popular during the Inquisition, a time when the obsession with rooting out heretics was so intense that a suspicious glance could earn you a one-way ticket to the dungeon. What's fascinating about the rack, if one can use that word without sounding morbid, is that it wasn't just about physical pain. It was a master of psychological torture. Imagine being strapped down, hearing the click-click-click of the crank, knowing that each turn would transform your body into something more akin to human spaghetti. The torturers, who probably weren't top candidates for an empathy award, understood that the anticipation of pain could be as effective as the pain itself. If you didn't confess to being a heretic, a witch, or stealing a loaf of bread, they'd stretch you a bit more, just to make sure you were being truly honest. And if you did confess, well, sometimes they kept stretching anyway, because consistency wasn't exactly a medieval virtue. The rack was so versatile that it was used across Europe, from England to Spain, adapting to local needs like a medieval chain store, except instead of selling bread, it offered guaranteed suffering. But the rack wasn't alone in the medieval torture repertoire. The stake is, without a doubt, the most iconic symbol of the era's cruelty, and it's not hard to see why. Burning someone at the stake wasn't just an execution. It was a public spectacle designed to leave a lasting impression on the collective memory. During the witch hunts, which peaked between the 15th and 17th centuries, stakes became a kind of community event, like an infernal barbecue where you were the main guest. If you were accused of witchcraft, heresy, or simply giving the village priest a dirty look, you could end up tied to a post with a pile of firewood at your feet, while a crowd watched with a mix of fear, curiosity, and, in some cases, enthusiasm we now reserve for football matches. The process of burning at the stake was anything but pleasant. First, you were tied to the post, sometimes with ropes, sometimes with chains to squash any faint hope of escape. Then, they piled dry wood around you, maybe with some straw to help the fire catch quickly. If the executioner was in a good mood, a rarity in a profession that didn't exactly attract cheerful types, they might hang a bag of gunpowder around your neck to speed things up. But if not, the fire could take its time consuming you, and the suffering was prolonged. The smoke choked you, the heat seared you, and the crowd. Well, they were probably split between those hurling insults, those praying for your soul, and those just looking for something exciting to talk about at the tavern later. In some cases, if you were lucky or had connections, they might strangle you before the flames started, a gesture considered an act of mercy in those days. Because, of course, in a world where burning someone alive was an option, mercy had a rather peculiar meaning. Stakes weren't just for witches. In England, for example, burning at the stake was the standard punishment for women convicted of treason or murdering their husbands, known as petty treason. Men, on the other hand, typically faced an equally gruesome fate: hanging, drawing, and quartering. Because, apparently, gender equality wasn't high on the medieval priority list. In France, A famous case is that of Joan of Arc, burned at the stake in 1431 for heresy and dressing as a man, which was apparently as serious as making a pact with the devil. Her execution was a political spectacle, designed to send a clear message. Don't defy the church or the crown, or you'll end up as the main attraction in the town square. Beyond racks and stakes, the Middle Ages were a period of boundless creativity in the art of inflicting pain. Take the breaking wheel, for example, a device that has nothing to do with a fairground ride, despite its name. The victim was tied to a large wooden wheel, and then, with a club or hammer, the executioner systematically broke their bones while the wheel spun. The goal wasn't just to cause pain, but to transform the person into a sort of broken puppet, displayed publicly so everyone could see the consequences of defying the established order. This method was especially popular in Germany and France, where it had a theatrical component that made it particularly macabre. The crowd didn't just watch, they participated in the spectacle, like a medieval version of a reality show, but with less glamour and more bone-crunching. Another spine-chilling method was flaying. Yes, exactly what it sounds like, removing a person's skin, usually while they were still alive. Though more common in antiquity, this punishment was also used in medieval Europe in certain contexts, particularly for treason or sacrilege. The precision required to flay someone without killing them immediately was, let's say, a skill you wouldn't want to highlight on a resume. In some cases, the skin was displayed as a trophy or warning, adding an extra layer of psychological horror. Imagine living in a village where the main entrance is decorated with something that used to be, well, someone. While not as widespread as the rack or the stake, flaying was a reminder that medieval cruelty knew no bounds when it came to punishment. And then there's impalement, a method most famously associated with Vlad the Impaler in the 15th century, but also used elsewhere in Europe during the Middle Ages. The concept was simple but horrifying. A sharpened stake was inserted into the victim's body, usually from the lower end, and gravity and body weight did the rest. In some cases, the stake was positioned to avoid vital organs, prolonging the suffering for hours or even days. Vlad, the ruler of Wallachia, was so fond of this method that chronicles claim he created forests of impaled bodies around his territories to deter his enemies. If that's not an aggressive PR strategy, I don't know what is. The Ottoman armies, who faced Vlad, were so impressed or horrified by these forests that some sources say they retreated upon seeing them. Because, clearly, nothing says, "Welcome to my kingdom," like a landscape filled with stakes and bodies. But not all tortures were so physical. Some played with the mind as much as the body. The shame mask, for instance, was a humiliating punishment used in Germany, Scotland, and other parts of Europe from the 13th to 17th centuries. These iron masks, often designed with grotesque shapes like animal heads or mocking faces, were placed on the victim's head, who was then paraded through the town. The idea wasn't just to cause discomfort, though the masks were heavy and sometimes had internal spikes, but to publicly humiliate. If you spoke ill of someone important, gossiped too much, or committed a minor offense, you could end up with a mask resembling a pig or a demon while neighbors hurled insults, rotten vegetables, or worse. It was like a medieval version of being cancelled on social media, but with more rust and fewer emojis. Another method that combined physical and psychological torment was water torture, used by the Spanish Inquisition and other ecclesiastical courts. No, it wasn't a spa session. It involved forcing the victim to swallow large amounts of water, sometimes through a funnel, until their stomachs swelled painfully. In some cases, an extra touch of cruelty was added by striking the swollen abdomen or placing weights on it. What made this method particularly insidious was that it left no visible marks, making it the perfect choice for torturers who wanted to keep things clean. Because, of course, when you're trying to extract a confession, appearances matter. This method was especially common in Spain, where the Inquisition perfected the art of causing suffering without leaving evidence that might inconvenience their superiors. Speaking of the Inquisition, we can't forget the strappado, a method that sounds like a Renaissance dance but was anything but festive. The victim was tied by their hands behind their back and hoisted by a rope until their shoulders dislocated. Sometimes, for a bit of variety, They were dropped and pulled back up, ensuring each movement was a symphony of cracks and screams. This method was so effective that it was widely used in Inquisition dungeons, particularly in Italy and Spain, where inquisitors saw it as a quick way to obtain confessions. It was like an infernal swing, but without the fun. The interrogation chair is another classic that no well-equipped dungeon could be without. This seat, covered with iron or wooden spikes, was anything but comfortable. The victim was strapped to the chair, and their own body weight caused the spikes to dig into their skin. In some cases, fire was added beneath to heat things up, literally. This method was especially popular in Germany during the witch hunts, where it was used to persuade the accused to confess their supposed pacts with the devil. The interrogation chair was a perfect example of how simplicity could be devastating. No pulleys or cranks needed, just a very unwelcoming seat and a patient torturer. And then there was the garrote, a method that, while more associated with modern Spain, had its origins in the Middle Ages. It consisted of a metal collar tightened around the victim's neck, breaking the spine or strangling them. It was an efficient method and, by the standards of the time, relatively humane, as death was usually quick. But let's not kid ourselves. Sitting in a chair with an executioner tightening screws behind your head wasn't exactly a relaxing experience. The garrote was so common that it was even used in Spanish colonies centuries later, proving that some medieval ideas had unsettling longevity. Another device that has captured the popular imagination is the Iron Maiden, though its use in the Middle Ages is more mythical than historical. This spiked sarcophagus, designed to slowly close and pierce the victim, appears in many Gothic horror stories, but there's little evidence it was widely used during the Middle Ages. Still, its image is so powerful that it has become a symbol of medieval cruelty, even if it was more an exaggeration by later chroniclers than a common device. But let's be honest, the idea of being embraced by a spiked coffin is enough to make anyone confess to things they didn't do. The whip, or flogging, was another universal method that didn't require much technology but did demand a good dose of enthusiasm from the executioner. In the Middle Ages, whips could be simple leather strips or equipped with metal, glass, or bone tips to maximize damage. In England, for instance, the cat o' nine tails, a whip with 9 strands, was used to punish criminals, especially in military or naval contexts. Each lash tore the skin, leaving scars as a permanent reminder of the punishment. Flogging was so common that it was often administered publicly, with the victim tied to a post in the town square while neighbors watched and, in some cases, cheered. Because, of course, in the Middle Ages, entertainment wasn't always a troubadour playing the lute. The pillory was another punishment that combined humiliation and pain. The victim was placed in a wooden structure with holes for their hands and feet, or sometimes just their head, and left exposed to the public. Beyond the discomfort of being immobilized in an awkward position, the crowd could hurl anything from insults to manure to rotten fruit. In England, the pillory was a common punishment for minor offenses like public drunkenness or petty theft. It wasn't lethal, but spending an entire day with your head and hands trapped while neighbors took out their frustrations wasn't exactly a picnic. In some cases, additional punishments were added, like cutting off ears or branding the skin with hot irons, to ensure the lesson was, quite literally, burned into you. Another method worth mentioning is the ordeal by fire, a trial by ordeal that, while not always considered torture, could certainly be so in practice. Common in the early Middle Ages, it involved the victim holding a red-hot iron or walking over burning coals. If the wounds healed quickly, it was considered proof of innocence. If not, guilt was assured. Used in England and other parts of Europe, this method was a mix of superstition and cruelty, as severe burns were almost inevitable, and the proof of healing depended more on luck than divine intervention. It was like playing Russian roulette, but with fire instead of bullets. Crushing with weights, known in England as peine forte et dure, was another method that combined simplicity with brutality. Used mainly in the 13th and 14th centuries, this punishment was applied to those who refused to plead guilty or not guilty in a trial. The victim was placed on the ground, and heavy rocks were piled on their chest until they confessed or died. The case of Giles Corey, though occurring in the 17th century during the Salem witch trials, is a later example of this method, which has medieval roots. Corey refused to plead and was slowly crushed over 2 days, maintaining his silence until the end. If that's not an example of medieval stubbornness, I don't know what is. Another bone-chilling method was torture by rats, a rare but documented practice in some parts of Europe, particularly Germany. The victim was tied down, and a cage of starving rats was placed on their abdomen. Then, the cage was heated with coals, causing the rats, desperate to escape, to burrow through the victim's body. It's hard to imagine a more gruesome fate, and the fact that someone thought to use rats as a torture tool says a lot about the darker side of medieval creativity. In the context of the Inquisition, the torment of the drop was also used, an early form of what we now know as waterboarding. The victim was tied down with a cloth covering their face, and water was slowly poured over it, simulating drowning. The sensation of suffocation, combined with the inability to move, was enough to make even the bravest confess anything. This method, like many Inquisition techniques, was particularly cruel because it left no visible marks, allowing inquisitors to maintain a facade of justice while inflicting unbearable suffering. During the Crusades, torture also played a significant role, especially in interrogating prisoners. The Knights Templar and other military orders sometimes used methods like foot roasting, where the victim's feet were heated with coals. This method was particularly effective because the pain was intense, but the marks weren't visible on parts of the body shown publicly. It was a discreet form of torture, if such a thing exists, and was used against both Muslim prisoners and Christians accused of treason or heresy. In the naval context, though less common in the Middle Ages, keel hauling began to appear toward the end of the period, particularly in the fleets of the Netherlands and other maritime countries. The victim was tied to a rope and dragged under the ship's hull, where barnacles and splinters could tear the skin. If you survived the scraping, which was rare, you still had to contend with the possibility of drowning or being eaten by sharks. This method was so extreme that even sailors, not exactly known for their gentleness, considered it a last resort. Another curious punishment was hot oil torture, used in some medieval castles and fortresses. Boiling oil was poured over specific parts of the body, usually the limbs, to cause severe burns without immediately killing the victim. This method was reserved for traitors or high-value prisoners, as oil was expensive and not wasted on just anyone. The executioner's precision was key, as the goal was to prolong suffering as a warning, not necessarily to end the victim's life. In the context of witch trials, tortures could be particularly cruel. In addition to the interrogation chair and water torture, the witch's bridle was used, an iron device placed on the accused head with a piece that entered the mouth to prevent speech. This method was especially humiliating, as the victim couldn't defend themselves verbally during interrogation. In some cases, the device had spikes that pierced the tongue or cheeks, adding an extra layer of pain. It was a way to silence the accused, both literally and figuratively, while subjecting them to endless questioning. Tortures in the Middle Ages weren't always physical. Excommunication, while not a physical torture, could be devastating in a deeply religious society. Being excommunicated meant being expelled from the Christian community, often leading to social ostracism and, in some cases, additional physical punishments. In a world where salvation was a constant concern, the threat of excommunication was a form of psychological torture that could be as effective as any rack or stake. In military contexts, torture was also used to maintain discipline. In medieval armies, soldiers who deserted or disobeyed could face punishments like running the gauntlet, where they had to run between 2 rows of comrades who beat them with sticks or straps. Though more common in the early modern period, this method has medieval roots and was a way to combine physical punishment with public humiliation. Surviving the gauntlet wasn't a guarantee of redemption, as additional punishments like mutilation or banishment were often added. In monasteries and convents, where one might expect a bit more mercy, forms of torture were also practiced, often disguised as penance. The cilice, a rough garment or one with spikes worn against the skin, was used by some monks and nuns to mortify the body and atone for sins. Though technically voluntary, in some cases, it was imposed as punishment for minor infractions, like speaking out of turn or breaking cloister rules. The psilus, combined with prolonged fasting and self-flagellation, was a form of torture justified as a path to holiness but no less painful. In medieval prisons, the oubliette was a form of torture by abandonment. These underground cells, whose name literally means place of forgetting in French, were narrow pits where prisoners were thrown and left to their fate. With no light, little air, and often stagnant water at the bottom, the oubliette was a slow death sentence. Some prisoners were deliberately forgotten, while others were occasionally visited to prolong their suffering with interrogations or additional punishments. The mere idea of being locked in a dark hole with no hope of escape was enough to break even the strongest. Another method combining physical and psychological torment was the pillory, a variant of the stocks that held the victim's head and hands. Used in England and other parts of Europe, the pillory was a punishment for crimes like fraud or slander. The victim was exposed to the public, who could throw anything from insults to garbage. In some cases, ears were cut off or skin was branded with hot irons as an additional punishment, ensuring the victim carried the mark of their crime for life. It was a way of saying, "We're not just punishing you, we want everyone to know it." In the context of ecclesiastical justice, tortures could also take subtler forms. Sleep deprivation was a method used by the Inquisition to weaken the accused before interrogation. Keeping someone awake for days, sometimes with constant noise or prodding, was a form of torture that left no visible marks but could drive the victim to the brink of madness. This method was particularly effective because confessions obtained in a state of extreme exhaustion were hard to retract, though also hard to trust. In medieval cities, public punishments also included branding or marking with a hot iron. Criminals could be branded on the face, hands, or chest with symbols indicating their crime, like a T for thief or an H for heretic. This punishment was not only painful but marked the person for life, turning them into a social outcast. In a society where reputation was everything, a visible mark was a form of torture that extended far beyond the moment of punishment. Another method worth mentioning is torture by boiling, where the victim was submerged in water, oil, or even molten lead. Though less common than other methods, it was used for treason or particularly heinous crimes. In England, during the reign of Henry VIII, some poisoners were boiled alive as punishment. The process was so horrific that even chroniclers of the time, accustomed to violence, described it with horror. The idea of being slowly cooked in a giant pot isn't something easily forgotten, even in an era where suffering was part of daily life. In the context of religious wars, tortures could be especially cruel. During the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, both sides used methods to punish heretics. In France, Huguenots were subjected to tortures like the boot torture, where wooden or metal boots were placed on the victim's legs and wedges were inserted to slowly crush the bones. This method was so painful that confessions were often quick, though not always truthful. On the Catholic side, the Inquisition perfected methods like the auto da fe, a public spectacle where heretics were judged, tortured, and often burned. These events were both a punishment and a display of power, designed to reinforce the Church's authority. In rural areas, tortures could be more improvised but no less cruel. In some villages, those accused of minor offenses were subjected to dunking, where they were repeatedly submerged in cold water, often in a river or lake. This method, used particularly against women accused of witchcraft, could result in hypothermia or drowning, and public humiliation was a key component. The victim was tied to a chair or pole and dunked while the crowd watched, often laughing or shouting insults. It was a form of torture that combined physical suffering with social degradation. During the Crusades, torture was also used to extract military information. Captured prisoners could be subjected to methods like flaying, a variant of skinning where only part of the skin was removed, or blinding, where the eyes were burned or gouged out to disable the enemy without killing them. These methods were especially cruel because they allowed captors to keep the prisoner alive as a trophy or bargaining chip in negotiations. In castle dungeons, another common method was starvation. Prisoners were left in cells without food or water, sometimes for weeks, until they confessed or died. This method was cheap and effective, requiring only a cell and a guard with little empathy. In some cases, poisoned food or contaminated water was offered as a way to prolong suffering, forcing the victim to choose between hunger and an even more painful death. In the context of feudal justice, local lords often had free rein to administer punishments, leading to a variety of improvised methods. In some cases, offenders were buried alive in shallow pits, with only their heads exposed, where they could be attacked by animals or die slowly from starvation and exposure. This method, though rare, was a form of torture that combined psychological terror with physical suffering, as the victim was fully aware of their fate while awaiting the inevitable. In more remote regions of Europe, like Scandinavia, tortures could have a more ritualistic component. While the blood eagle mentioned earlier is likely an exaggeration by Christian chroniclers, the Vikings did use methods like burning at the stake, where prisoners were burned alive as part of rituals or punishments. These acts, though less documented, reflect the brutality of a warrior society where suffering was often a spectacle to reinforce the leader's power. In ecclesiastical courts, tortures could also be more psychological. Exposure on the cross was a method where the victim was tied in a position mimicking crucifixion, but without nails, and left there for hours or days. The physical pain of the position, combined with the humiliation of being displayed as a heretic, was enough to break many accused. This method was particularly common in regions where the Church held strong control, like southern France during the Albigensian Crusade. In the realm of corporal punishment, amputation or mutilation was another common method. Cutting off hands, feet, noses, or tongues was a form of punishment that not only inflicted pain but marked the victim for life, making them a social outcast. In England, for example, thieves could lose a hand, while in France, blasphemers might lose their tongue. These mutilations were often public, with the executioner using an axe or a hot knife to cauterize the wound and prevent the victim from bleeding to death. It was a form of torture that combined immediate pain with long-term suffering. In larger cities like Paris or London, public punishments also included whipping through the streets, where the victim was flogged while forced to walk through the main streets. This method, used against common criminals and heretics, was a form of public humiliation that ensured the entire community was aware of the crime. The whip, often with metal tips, could cause severe injuries, and prolonged exposure to cold or heat added another layer of suffering. In the context of the Inquisition, tortures could also be more sophisticated. The pendulum torture, though more associated with later stories, has medieval roots in methods where the victim was hung upside down and swung over sharp objects or coals. The constant motion, combined with the pain of wounds, was a form of torture that could last hours, leaving the victim in a state of physical and mental exhaustion. In rural areas, where resources were limited, tortures could be more improvised. Drowning in a sack, for example, was a punishment used in some parts of Europe against women accused of infanticide or adultery. The victim was placed in a sack, sometimes with an animal like a cat or snake, and thrown into a river or lake. The combination of suffocation, panic, and the animal's presence made this a particularly cruel punishment, though not as common as other methods. In the context of feudal wars, tortures were also used to intimidate enemies. Prisoners of war could be subjected to methods like skinning alive, a form of flaying where the skin was removed in front of other prisoners to send a clear message. This method, though rare, was a display of power that could demoralize an entire army. In some cases, flayed bodies were displayed on castle walls as a sort of macabre decoration. In German cities, tortures could also be more public. The shame flute was a wooden or metal wind instrument placed around the neck of bad musicians or troublemakers, forcing them to parade through the streets while being ridiculed. Though less painful than other methods, the public humiliation was a form of psychological torture that could be devastating in a society where honor was everything. In the context of the Inquisition, tortures could also be more prolonged. Slow roasting was a method where the victim was placed near a fire, but not close enough to kill them immediately. The slow heat caused severe burns and dehydration, and the victim could spend hours in agony before a decision was made about their fate. This method, used in Spain and other regions, was a form of torture that combined physical pain with the cruel hope of possible release. In rural France, tortures could also include the wooden horse, a device where the victim was seated on a pointed structure with weights tied to their feet. The pain of the pressure on the pelvis, combined with the weights stretching the body, was unbearable, and the method was used to extract quick confessions. In some cases, blows or burns were added to increase suffering, making the wooden horse one of the most feared tortures in rural dungeons. In the context of witch trials, tortures could be particularly specific to women. The witch's needle was a method where the accused body was pricked with long needles to find the devil's mark, a supposed insensitive spot that proved witchcraft. This process, which could last hours, was painful and humiliating, and was often performed in public to increase pressure on the victim. The needles, sometimes heated, caused severe injuries, and the lack of hygiene in medieval dungeons meant infections were almost inevitable. In Northern Europe, like Scotland, tortures could also be more environmental. The cold water torture involved exposing the victim to extreme cold, often naked or in light clothing, for long periods. In the harsh northern winters, this method could cause hypothermia and frostbite, and was particularly cruel because the suffering was slow and silent. The victim, tied or locked in an unheated cell, could spend days shivering before torturers decided to interrogate them. In the context of feudal punishments, tortures could also be more symbolic. The shaving of the head was a punishment used against women accused of adultery or heresy. Shaving the head was not only humiliating in a society where long hair was a symbol of femininity, but also exposed the victim to public ridicule. In some cases, it was combined with other punishments, like the pillory or whipping, to increase suffering. In French castle dungeons, tortures could also include the thumbscrew, a device that crushed the victim's thumbs with screws. This method, though small compared to the rack or wheel, was extremely painful due to the sensitivity of the thumbs. It was a portable form of torture that could be used at any time, and its simplicity made it ideal for quick interrogations. In the context of ecclesiastical justice, tortures could also be more ritualistic. The penance whip was a whip used by priests to punish sinners, often in public. Though justified as a form of redemption, the pain was real, and the lashes could cause severe injuries. In some cases, the victim was forced to whip themselves, adding an element of self-humiliation to the punishment. In Italian cities like Florence, tortures could also be more political. The strappado was used against conspirators and traitors, often in combination with methods like water torture. The rulers of city-states, like the Medici, used these tortures to maintain control in a politically unstable environment where conspiracies were as common as palace intrigues. During the Crusades, tortures could also be more improvised. Crusaders sometimes used methods like hot sand torture, where the victim was buried in hot sand up to their neck, letting the sun and heat do the rest. This method, used in Middle Eastern deserts, was a way to combine the environment with cruelty, and the suffering could last hours as the victim slowly dehydrated. In rural Germany, tortures could also include the shame mask, a variant of the shame mask designed specifically for minor offenders. These masks, often shaped like animals, were both humiliating and uncomfortable, and the victim was forced to wear them for hours while being ridiculed by the crowd. In the context of religious justice, tortures could also be more ritualistic. The penance chain was a device used by priests to punish sinners, binding them with heavy chains that restricted movement. Though justified as a form of redemption, the pain was real, and the humiliation of being chained in a religious setting added an extra layer of suffering. In English castle dungeons, tortures could also include the iron collar, a collar with internal spikes placed around the victim's neck. This method, used against political prisoners, was a form of torture that relied on the victim's endurance, who often collapsed after hours of suffering. In the context of witch trials, tortures could also include the witch's cradle, a device where the victim was enclosed in a bag or cage and hung, swung to cause disorientation and nausea. This method, used in Germany and Scotland, was a form of psychological torture that could drive the victim to confess anything to escape the constant motion. In southern Europe, like Spain, tortures could also include fire torture, where the victim was exposed to coals or hot irons without direct contact, causing burns by radiation. This method, used against heretics, was a way to combine physical pain with psychological pressure, as the victim could see and feel the heat slowly approaching. In the context of feudal punishments, tortures could also be more communal. Public whipping was a punishment used against common criminals, where the victim was flogged in the town square, often naked or semi-naked, to maximize humiliation. The whip, which could have metal tips, caused severe injuries, and public exposure ensured the lesson was learned by all present. In French castle dungeons, tortures could also include the hand screw, a device that crushed the victim's hands with screws. This method, similar to the thumb screw, was extremely painful due to the sensitivity of the hands and could leave the victim incapacitated for weeks. It was a portable form of torture that could be used at any time, and its simplicity made it ideal for quick interrogations. In the context of ecclesiastical justice, tortures could also be more prolonged. Dark cell torture was a method where the victim was locked in a dark, solitary cell for weeks or months with minimal human contact. This method, used against heretics and dissidents, was a form of psychological torture that could drive the victim to the brink of madness. The lack of light, sound, and human contact was enough to break even the strongest. In rural England, tortures could also include hot wax torture, where hot wax was poured over the victim's body, causing severe burns. This method, used against those accused of witchcraft and heresy, was particularly cruel because the pain was intense and localized, and the wounds could easily become infected in the unsanitary conditions of medieval dungeons. In the context of feudal punishments, tortures could also be more symbolic. Branding with a letter was a punishment used against common criminals, where a letter was marked on the victim's skin, like a T for thief or an H for heretic. This method, besides being painful, marked the victim for life, making them a social outcast in a society where reputation was everything. In Italian cities like Venice, tortures could also be more political. The strappado was used against conspirators and traitors, often in combination with methods like water torture. The rulers of city-states used these tortures to maintain control in a politically unstable environment where conspiracies were as common as gondolas. During the Crusades, tortures could also be more improvised. Crusaders sometimes used methods like hot coal torture, where glowing coals were placed near the victim's body, causing burns by radiation. This method, used in military camps, was a way to combine physical pain with psychological pressure, as the victim could see and feel the heat slowly approaching. In rural Germany, tortures could also include the shame bell, a device where the victim was forced to wear a bell around their neck while being paraded through the village. The bell, which rang with every movement, was both humiliating and uncomfortable, and the victim was ridiculed by the crowd while trying to maintain composure. In the context of religious justice, tortures could also be more ritualistic. The penance collar was a device used by priests to punish sinners, binding them with a metal collar that was slowly tightened, causing pain and restricting movement. Though justified as a form of redemption, the pain was real, and the humiliation of being bound in a religious setting added an extra layer of suffering. In English castle dungeons, tortures could also include the spiked collar, a collar with internal spikes placed around the victim's neck. This method, used against political prisoners, was a form of torture that relied on the victim's endurance, who often collapsed after hours of suffering. In the context of witch trials, tortures could also include the witch's scale, where the victim was weighed against an object, like a Bible, to determine their guilt. If they weighed more or less than expected, they were considered guilty and often subjected to additional tortures, like water torture or the interrogation chair. This method, used in Germany and Scotland, was a form of torture disguised as a scientific test, though the outcome was practically guaranteed. In southern Europe, like Italy, tortures could also include rope torture, where the victim was bound with ropes that were slowly tightened, cutting into the skin and causing intense pain. This method, used against conspirators and heretics, was a way to combine physical pain with psychological pressure, as the victim could feel the ropes tightening with each passing moment. In the context of feudal punishments, tortures could also be more communal. Public dunking was a punishment used against women accused of minor offenses, like gossip or disobedience. The victim was submerged in cold water, often in a river or lake, while the crowd watched and mocked. Humiliation was the primary goal, but the risk of hypothermia or drowning added an element of danger. In French castle dungeons, tortures could also include the foot screw, a device that crushed the victim's feet with screws. This method, similar to the thumb screw, was extremely painful due to the sensitivity of the feet and could leave the victim incapacitated for weeks. It was a portable form of torture that could be used at any time, and its simplicity made it ideal for quick interrogations. In the context of ecclesiastical justice, tortures could also be more prolonged. Isolation torture was a method where the victim was locked in a dark, solitary cell for weeks or months with minimal human contact. This method, used against heretics and dissidents, was a form of psychological torture that could drive the victim to the brink of madness. The lack of light, sound, and human contact was enough to break even the strongest. In rural England, tortures could also include hot needle torture, where hot needles were inserted into sensitive parts of the body, like fingernails or joints. This method, used against those accused of witchcraft and heresy, was particularly cruel because the pain was intense and localized, and the wounds could easily become infected in the unsanitary conditions of medieval dungeons. In the context of feudal punishments, tortures could also be more symbolic. Branding with a cross was a punishment used against heretics, where a cross was marked on the victim's skin with a hot iron. This method, besides being painful, had a religious component, as the cross was a constant reminder of the redemption the victim was supposed to seek. In Italian cities like Rome, tortures could also be more political. The strappado was used against conspirators and traitors, often in combination with methods like water torture. The church's rulers used these tortures to maintain control in a politically unstable environment where intrigues were as common as daily masses. During the Crusades, tortures could also be more improvised. Crusaders sometimes used methods like hot coal torture, where glowing coals were placed near the victim's body, causing burns by radiation. This method, used in military camps, was a way to combine physical pain with psychological pressure, as the victim could see and feel the heat slowly approaching. In rural Germany, tortures could also include the shame chain, a device where the victim was forced to wear heavy chains around their neck or wrists while being paraded through the village. The chains, which restricted movement, were both humiliating and uncomfortable, and the victim was ridiculed by the crowd while trying to maintain composure. In the context of religious justice, tortures could also be more ritualistic. The penance rope was a device used by priests to punish sinners, binding them with ropes that were slowly tightened, causing pain and restricting movement. Though justified as a form of redemption, the pain was real, and the humiliation of being bound in a religious setting added an extra layer of suffering. In English castle dungeons, tortures could also include the spiked collar, a collar with internal spikes placed around the victim's neck. This method, used against political prisoners, was a form of torture that relied on the victim's endurance, who often collapsed after hours of suffering. In the context of witch trials, tortures could also include the witch's cradle, a device where the victim was enclosed in a bag or cage and hung, swung to cause disorientation and nausea. This method, used in Germany and Scotland, was a form of psychological torture that could drive the victim to confess anything to escape the constant motion.